On January 2nd, 1992, the Russian government stopped controlling the price of almost everything it sold. Bread, fuel, rent, medicine overnight, the state let go of the wheel. Within a year, prices had multiplied by somewhere between 16 and 25 times over. A pension that had covered a family's groceries in November couldn't cover a loaf of bread by December. This is the Soviet Union's final year, and Russia's first one. And here's what almost nobody tells you. This country did it again. In 2022, its currency cratered a second time, under an entirely different set of circumstances. Different decade, different government, different trigger. Same country. Same outcome. Four things carried ordinary people through both collapses. Only one of them is a currency. One of them isn't even an asset, it's a phone call to the right person. Stay with me, because by the end, you'll know exactly which four, and why the same four keep showing up, 30 years apart, in the same place. To understand what happened, you need to understand what Boris Yeltsin's government and the economist he put in charge were trying to solve. For decades, Soviet central planners had set prices by decree, not supply and demand. That kept official numbers stable, but it also meant empty shelves. The price was fake, so the product wasn't there. When the Soviet Union formally dissolved on December 25, 1991, Yeltsin's team inherited an economy where the paper was cheap and the goods were missing. Their fix was called shock therapy, signed into effect by Yegor Gaidar, Yeltsin's acting prime minister and the reform's chief architect. On January 2nd, 1992, price controls came off almost everywhere at once, backed by roughly $24 billion in Western and imp support. Gaidar predicted prices would rise 3 to 5 times. Instead, the numbers tell you how brutal that year's hyperinflation actually was. Estimates converge around 2,300% for 1992. With some retrospectives citing figures well over 2,500%. Prices didn't rise, they detonated, multiplying close to 30 times over. The following year, 1993, inflation was still running at 874%. And here's what gets left out of the popular version of this story. The government's own budget deficit hit 20% of GDP by the end of 1992. 4 times what had been projected, financed by printing money. The hyperinflation wasn't a side effect of freeing prices, it was being actively fed by the same government that promised the pain would be temporary. Your bank balance, if you were a Russian citizen watching this happen, didn't change. What that balance could buy did. That distinction, the number staying the same while its meaning evaporates, is the entire story of every currency collapse in history. Before 1992, the shortage had been physical, empty shelves, ration coupons, pre-dawn queues. After 1992, the shortage was purely arithmetic. Goods reappeared on shelves almost immediately. But by then, people's savings had already lost the ability to buy them. So the real question isn't what happened to the money. It's who wasn't relying on that money in the first place. One group didn't need a bank account at all. Before 1991, the Soviet Union ran on a subsidized, centrally managed agricultural system. When that system started failing, the question stopped being, how much is my money worth? And became, is there food, at any price? And the people who kept eating weren't concentrated in the countryside, they were disproportionately ordinary Moscow apartment dwellers with a small garden plot a short trip outside the city. The dacha, an UNDP study found that 65% of Moscow families were gardening on these plots in 1991, up from roughly 20% in 1970, the majority of a capital city's households quietly building a second food supply outside the official economy. By 2000, according to Russia's own government statistics, roughly 71% of the population, something like 35 million families, were doing the same thing nationally, producing an estimated 92% of the country's potatoes, roughly 77% of its vegetables, and around 87% of its berries and fruit, a parallel food system built plot by plot, years before anyone needed it to hold up under pressure. A field study out of 2 smaller cities, Oryol and Gagarin, found that in the early 1990s, up to 60% of the food families actually ate came from these household plots, not stores or state distribution. Researchers who study food security in this period are blunt. Dacha gardening is the reason Russia didn't experience a famine when subsidized commercial agriculture collapsed alongside the Soviet state. Notice what this asset actually is. It isn't land as an investment. Nobody was flipping dacha plots for capital gains. It's land you personally work, producing something you can eat regardless of what a ruble is worth that week, the same logic that kept self-sufficient estates functioning during Rome's 3rd century crisis, 17 centuries earlier, on a different continent. Detach yourself from a supply chain that depends on a currency, and the currency's collapse stops being your emergency. The dacha didn't beat inflation. It made inflation irrelevant to the one thing that actually kills people during a collapse, whether they can eat. If the ruble was disintegrating, what were people actually holding instead? Research out of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York gives you the answer in one number. An estimated $44 billion in physical US dollar currency was exported into Russia between 1989 and 1996. For comparison, Argentina, going through its own currency crisis in the same window, absorbed about $35 billion over the same years. That's not a coincidence. Researchers who study dollarization describe the same motive every time it shows up. In every country, people hold a stronger foreign currency to hedge against inflation, default, or their own government's ability to confiscate what they've saved. Russians in the early 1990s weren't buying dollars hoping for a return. They were exiting a system they no longer trusted, using whichever exit was fastest and most universally accepted. This complicates the usual gold standard story. The classic hard money answer to a collapsing currency is bullion, no counterparty, no government behind it. But in 1990s Russia, the dominant hedge wasn't gold, it was a different government's paper. Because in a genuine emergency, liquidity can matter more than purity. A dollar could be spent at a black market kiosk that same afternoon. A gold coin needed someone willing to appraise it first. By broader estimates in the dollarization literature, foreign currency holdings accumulated across dollarizing economies during this era reached something in the neighborhood of $300 billion, with Russia accounting for a meaningful slice. This wasn't a clever loophole a handful of people discovered, it was mainstream behavior, an entire shadow economy running in parallel with an official currency that was losing its meaning in real time. Someone had to physically move that cash across a border, in bulk, repeatedly, for years, into a country in the middle of a political collapse. That scale of infrastructure only exists to serve mainstream demand, not a fringe habit a handful of people were quietly indulging. When people stop trusting a currency, they don't wait around for a theoretically purer alternative to be invented or mined. They reach for whichever competing currency is already sitting in the room. Here's where the story stops being about protecting what you have and starts being about who ended up owning what used to belong to the state. As part of privatization, nearly every one of Russia's roughly 148 million citizens was issued a voucher, a paper certificate, nominally worth 10,000 rubles, a theoretical stake in formerly state-owned industry. Most people treated them as close to worthless against the backdrop of currency chaos, selling them cheap, in bulk, often at auctions barely publicized and held far from where most citizens could realistically attend. Harvard economist Marshall Goldman later described the entire process, in a book on the subject, as less a genuine privatization than a wholesale transfer of state wealth to a small, politically connected group. Then, in 1995, facing a fiscal crisis with a presidential election looming in 1996, Yeltsin's government adopted a scheme proposed by banker Vladimir Potanin, loans for shares. Commercial banks lent the cash-strapped government money, receiving shares in the country's largest industrial companies as collateral. The loans were never repaid. The shares simply stayed with the lenders at a fraction of what they were worth. The names matter, because this isn't an abstract mechanism, it's a small number of specific people. Vladimir Potanin walked away with Norilsk Nickel, one of the largest metals and mining companies on the planet. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who'd started in black market trading before founding Bank Menatep, ended up controlling Yukos Oil without even placing the highest bid. Boris Berezovsky took Sibneft. Within a handful of years, these men had gone from bankers and traders to some of the wealthiest individuals in the world. Russia had a new class of oligarchs it hadn't had a decade earlier. What actually separated the pensioner who sold his voucher for the rough equivalent of a bottle of vodka from the banker who ended up owning an oil company wasn't cash on hand, or foresight about which industries would matter in 10 years. It was proximity, a relationship with the people structuring the deal, a seat at a table most citizens didn't know existed. Same paper, same country, a completely different owner, decided almost entirely by who you already knew. And it didn't just pay off once. The companies these men acquired for a fraction of their value became the backbone of Russia's economy for the following 3 decades. Gold protects you from a currency losing its value. A phone call to the right person can protect you from everyone else who's also trying to survive the same collapse, or let you profit from it directly. This is the question the whole video has been building toward. Was 1992 a singular accident, or is this simply what happens to this particular country, on a schedule? In 1998, Russia crashed again. The mechanism was completely different this time, not price liberalization, but short-term government bonds called GKOs, first issued in 1993, used to paper over a budget deficit that never got fixed. By 1998, national debt had climbed to roughly $200 billion, about 44% of GDP, and the government defaulted on its own domestic debt. The ruble devalued sharply, and inflation spiked to over 84% that year. The shockwaves didn't stay inside Russia's borders. That same default helped trigger the collapse of long-term capital management, a Connecticut hedge fund run by Nobel Prize-winning economists, whose implosion came close enough to threatening the global financial system that the Federal Reserve organized a private sector bailout to contain it. Then it happened again in 2022. Western sanctions hit the ruble hard after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the response from ordinary Russians was almost a rerun of the 1990s playbook. Bloomberg reported Russians bought roughly 282 tons of physical gold bars, coins, jewelry in the months following. Demand for gold and palladium reportedly quadrupled at major Russian banks. Wealthier Russians moved into luxury jewelry and watches for the identical reason pensioners once lined up for dollars 30 years earlier. Get your wealth into something the government issuing your currency doesn't directly control. 3 different triggers across 3 different decades of currency reform gone wrong. A sovereign debt default, a geopolitical sanctions shock, and the same 4 behaviors show up every single time. Grow food you don't have to buy, hold a currency or metal your own government can't print more of, get close to institutional access if it's available to you, and hold something physical that isn't a promise from anyone. That last point has the clearest present-day echo. In 2026, gold reached an all-time high globally, touching somewhere around $300 an ounce before pulling back, driven by the same instinct that sent Russians into gold shops in 2022. Just at a planetary scale. Investor Ray Dalio has spent years describing this as part of a recurring big cycle of debt and currency crises, whether or not you take his full framework. The pattern is sitting in the data from 1992, 1998, and 2022, from one country, 3 separate times. None of the 4 things that worked required correctly predicting why the next crisis would happen. That's the actual point. They worked regardless of the mechanism. What actually survived, across 1992, 1998, and 2022, in the same country, comes down to 4 things. Food you grow yourself, a currency or metal your own government doesn't control, relationships the market can't price into a formula, and something physical that isn't anybody's liability. None of that required intelligence nobody else had, or luck. It required distance from a system that was, structurally, always going to fail eventually, just not on a schedule anyone could guarantee in advance. None of this is unique to Russia, and that's the uncomfortable part. Every currency, everywhere, is fundamentally a promise made by a government. And every promise, eventually, runs into a Tuesday where the terms get quietly renegotiated without anyone asking your permission first. If you've made it this far, you already know which of these 4 you've been building for yourself, and which one you've been ignoring. Maybe it's the food, maybe it's the metal, maybe it's the relationships that never show up on a balance sheet at all. Russia didn't get a warning before 1992. It didn't get a clean one before 2022 either. The warning had already been sitting there for 30 years. Nobody was listening the first time it was given.